I grew up in a small town in Pennsylvania, where everybody knew each other and nothing truly unsettling ever happened. Until one night changed that for me forever. This was back in my early 20s, when I was drifting through life, unsure of my next steps. I had recently broken up with my girlfriend of 2 years, and while I wasn't exactly heartbroken, there was this lingering emptiness I couldn't shake. One Friday evening, I met a girl named Lily at a local coffee shop. She sat alone near the window, idly stirring a cup of tea, her blonde hair tucked behind one ear. She had this quiet, almost haunting beauty, like she belonged in another time. Our conversation started naturally. I complimented the classic book she was reading, and she looked up at me with these deep gray eyes that seemed to know too much. We talked for nearly an hour. She was charming but evasive when it came to personal details. She said she had just moved to town and didn't have many friends yet. Something about her was magnetic, and by the end of our conversation, I found myself asking her out on a proper date. She smiled a slow, knowing kind of smile and agreed. We exchanged numbers, and I walked out of that coffee shop feeling something I hadn't in a long time. Excitement. That night, we texted back and forth, and our conversation was easy and playful. She didn't have much of a social media presence, which was odd, but I liked that about her. She felt real, different. I planned our date for Sunday evening, a simple dinner at a quiet restaurant on the outskirts of town. Sunday came, and I got to the restaurant a little early. I sat at a booth by the window, watching cars pass, waiting for her. 5 minutes passed, then 10, then 20. I texted her. No response. I called, straight to voicemail. I started to wonder if I had been stood up, but something about it didn't feel right. It wasn't just that she wasn't there. It was like she had never existed at all. I left the restaurant and drove by the coffee shop where we had met, hoping maybe I'd find her there again. But when I asked the barista about her, she just frowned. "There wasn't a blonde girl sitting by the window on Friday," she said, shaking her head. "I was working that night. You were sitting alone." A chill ran through me. That didn't make sense. I talked to her. I had her number. I pulled out my phone to prove it. But when I opened my messages, her texts were gone. The contact was gone, like she had never been there in the first place. I drove home in silence, my mind racing, trying to rationalize what had happened. Maybe I imagined her. Maybe I had dreamed it all. But then, how did I end up at the restaurant, waiting for someone who didn't exist? I barely slept that night. I kept going over every detail of our conversation, every moment we spent together. She had been real. She had to be. The next morning, I went back to the coffee shop one last time. I sat at the same window seat, hoping, waiting. And then, just as I was about to give up, I saw her. She was across the street, standing perfectly still, watching me. Her expression was blank, her gray eyes empty. I blinked, and she was gone. To this day, I don't know who or what Lily was. I never saw her again, never found a trace of her existence. But every so often, when I pass by that coffee shop, I feel a chill creep up my spine. Because somewhere, in the depths of my mind, I know she's still watching me. I never thought I'd be the kind of person to believe in things that can't be explained. But after that night, I don't think I have a choice anymore. I was on a long drive through the Arizona desert, heading back home after visiting my brother in New Mexico. I always loved road trips. Just me, the open highway, and the silence of the night. But this time, something felt different. Like the road was waiting for me, watching me. The storm came out of nowhere. My old car wasn't built for this kind of weather. The wipers barely worked, and I could hardly see the road. When I saw a green highway sign for a rest stop, I didn't think twice. I pulled over, hoping the storm would pass. The place was deserted. A single, run-down gas station, the kind that looks abandoned even when it's open. I went inside to grab a coffee, maybe ask how long the storm would last. "You shouldn't be out here tonight." The guy behind the counter barely looked at me. His voice was low, uneasy. I chuckled, trying to break the tension. "Yeah, the storm's pretty bad. Just waiting it out. It's not the storm you should be worried about." I forced a smile, grabbed my coffee, and left. Maybe he was just messing with me. Maybe he was crazy. Either way, I wasn't sticking around to find out. The moment I got back on the highway, something felt off. The road stretched for miles, but my headlights caught something in the distance. A hitchhiker. A man in a soaked hoodie, standing still, was staring straight at me. I should have just kept driving. I don't know why I didn't. Maybe it was guilt or curiosity. But I slowed down, and that's when everything went wrong. As soon as I passed him, my engine started to stall. The dashboard lights flickered, and in my rearview mirror, he was gone. Panic set in. I tried the ignition again, but the car wouldn't start. My phone had no signal. I was alone, or at least I thought I was. Then, I heard it. A tapping sound. Slow, deliberate. I turned my head, and my blood ran cold. He was there, but something was wrong. His face, it was blurred, like looking at a smudged photo. "You shouldn't be out here tonight." My whole body locked up. I reached for the lock, but the door slowly began to creak open on its own. And then, I wasn't in my car anymore. I was standing in the middle of the highway, miles away from where I'd pulled over. My car was gone. The storm was gone. The road was dry. "Hey, you okay?" I couldn't speak. I just nodded and got in. The driver, a woman, looked at me through the rearview mirror. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I wanted to tell her everything. But before I could, she frowned. "Wait, did you hear that?" I'll never forget the night I drove through that strange town. My name's Jake, and my wife Sophie and I were making a long drive from Nashville to Chicago. We were visiting some family, and it had been a great trip. By the time we were heading back, we were both exhausted and ready to get home. We decided to do the drive in one shot, no hotel stops. It was a terrible idea. Somewhere along the way, we passed through a little town off the highway. We'd been on the road for hours, and I needed to stretch my legs. The signs for the town promised a quick stop. Fuel, food, maybe a little break from the endless stretch of highway. Sophie wasn't thrilled, but agreed. I could tell she was getting sleepy too. We took the exit, and from the moment we pulled off the highway, something felt wrong. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. No cars, no pedestrians, nothing. The kind of silence that almost feels unnatural. Even though the town was clearly open for business, it felt abandoned. The lights in some of the shops were on, but not a soul in sight. It was like walking through a place frozen in time. We pulled up to a small diner and parked. I wasn't hungry, but Sophie insisted we grab a coffee. I got out of the car, stretching my stiff legs. The air was oddly still, and as we walked toward the diner, I noticed something even stranger. The streetlights were flickering, casting eerie, random shadows across the sidewalk. Inside, the diner looked perfectly normal. It was a small, retro-style place. There were a few booths, a counter, and a couple of old jukeboxes. A waitress greeted us with a smile, too bright, almost too forced. We sat down, and I ordered a coffee while Sophie picked out a slice of pie. The waitress didn't leave the counter. She just stood there, staring at us. It felt like she was waiting for something. When the food came, I couldn't help but notice the silence. No other customers, not even a hum of the fridge or a clink of dishes. Just that unnerving stillness. We ate in uncomfortable silence, both of us feeling like we were being watched. I kept looking around, and something caught my eye. The door. It had just opened, or so I thought. But when I looked back, the door was closed. I'd been certain it was open a second ago. That's when I felt a chill crawl up my spine. Sophie noticed too. "You okay?" she asked. "Yeah, I don't know. I have this weird feeling," I replied, trying to shake it off. When we finished, we stood to leave. As we walked to the door, the waitress didn't say a word. She just stood there, watching us. I didn't like it. It felt like she was waiting, like she was expecting us to do something. I almost asked her if something was wrong, but instead, I just opened the door and stepped outside. The instant we left the diner, I froze. The street was completely different. The gas station we'd passed earlier was now just a dark building with no lights. The road that had seemed normal was now overgrown with weeds, and the shops, where had they gone? The whole street was empty, like it was in the middle of nowhere, even though just moments ago it had been bustling with activity. Sophie grabbed my arm. "Jake, let's just go. This doesn't feel right." I agreed, and we rushed back to the car. But when we got in, the oddest thing happened. The town that had been so quiet before, now it was packed. Cars filled the streets. People were walking everywhere, but none of them seemed to notice us. It was like we had stepped into another version of the town, one that existed just a few moments after we had left. My heart raced. Sophie's face went pale. We didn't say anything for a while. It was like we both knew something was deeply wrong. We got back on the highway, but something felt off about the drive. The road stretched endlessly, and no matter how far we went, it felt like we hadn't made any progress. We kept passing the same road signs, the same landmarks, as if time had looped, and we were stuck in a place that didn't want to let us leave. Then, I saw something that made my stomach drop. A car passed us, a rusty old sedan, the kind you'd expect to see in an abandoned junkyard. It had a huge dent on the front, and the headlights were cracked. It passed us, and I remember staring at it because it didn't belong on a highway like this. I even pointed it out to Sophie, who just shrugged. But then, just a few minutes later, I saw it again. The same car, the same dent, the same cracked headlights. "How is this possible?" I muttered. "We didn't stop, didn't get off the highway. How can it be ahead of us?" Sophie started to panic. "Jake, something's wrong. Something's really wrong. I tried to keep calm. I tried to explain it away, but deep down, I knew she was right. The world around us was shifting, bending in a way I couldn't explain. We kept driving, the unease growing with every mile. And when I glanced at the GPS, it said we had been driving for hours longer than we had. No exits, no detours, just a straight line through a town that no longer existed. We finally made it home, but even after all that time, the feeling didn't go away. I can still hear the eerie silence, still feel that gut-wrenching unease when I think about it. I tried to look up any similar stories, any explanation for what happened, but I came up empty. There were no records of that town. It wasn't even on the map. And I still don't know what happened, but I know this. There are places where the rules of reality don't apply. And I don't ever want to find myself in one of them again. This happened a few months ago, and I still can't wrap my head around it. My name's Brian, and I was on a solo road trip from San Diego to Seattle. I'd been wanting to drive up the coast for a while, clear my head, and just take in the sights. Nothing too crazy, just a long drive, some music, and a few stops along the way. Everything was going fine until I passed through a small town just after sunset. I don't even know the name of it, honestly. The signs were faded, and the town wasn't listed on my GPS, but I figured it was a small, off-the-beaten-path place that didn't register on modern maps. I needed gas, so I took the next exit. I drove through the streets, and at first, it seemed like a perfectly normal small town. But there was one thing that stood out. It was dead silent. No cars, no people, no animals, just quiet. The kind of stillness you usually find in the early hours of the morning, not at dusk. I pulled into a gas station and noticed there was a single person standing by the pumps. An older man, probably in his 60s, wearing a plaid shirt and a cap. He didn't move, just stood there staring at my car. It felt like he was waiting for me. I wasn't too thrilled about stopping, but my gas light had been on for a while, and there was no other station for miles. I grabbed my wallet, got out of the car, and approached him. "Evening," I said, trying to break the ice. The man just nodded, not saying a word. His eyes didn't leave me as I pumped the gas. It was uncomfortable, like he knew something I didn't. When I finished, I walked into the small shop to pay. The door opened with a loud creak, and a bell rang. Behind the counter stood a woman, maybe in her 40s. She had dark hair and was wearing a faded apron. Her expression was neutral, almost emotionless. I paid for the gas, but as I was leaving, I noticed something odd. There was a phone on the counter, an old-fashioned rotary phone. It wasn't plugged in or anything, just sitting there like it was some sort of relic from a time long gone. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just a quirky little shop. But as I stepped out the door, the man outside was gone. No sign of him anywhere. I didn't think much of it at the time, but as I got back in my car, I felt watched. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was staring at me. I locked the doors and started the engine, eager to get back on the road. I was about to pull out when my phone rang. I wasn't expecting any calls. My family knew I was on the road, but they weren't supposed to call until tomorrow. I checked the screen. No number, just unknown caller. My gut told me not to answer, but I did anyway. "Hello?" I said, my voice sounding a little shaky. There was silence on the other end for a few seconds before a deep, gravelly voice spoke. "Get out of the town." My heart skipped a beat. "What?" The voice repeated, this time more urgent. "Get out of the town. Now." Before I could respond, the line went dead. I immediately tried to call back, but the number didn't exist. My phone had no record of the call at all. I was shaken. I looked around, half expecting someone to be watching me. But the parking lot was empty. No sign of the old man. No one anywhere. I didn't hesitate. I turned the car around and sped out of the station, determined to put as much distance between me and that place as possible. I kept driving for what felt like hours, constantly checking the rearview mirror, expecting someone or something to follow me. But the road remained empty, and soon I calmed down, thinking it was just my imagination running wild. That's when it happened again. My phone rang. I checked the screen. Unknown caller, again. My heart pounded in my chest, but I answered it anyway. "Hello?" This time, the voice was colder, almost angry. "You didn't listen." Before I could respond, the line went dead again. I pulled over to the side of the road, my hands shaking. I had no idea what was going on, but it was becoming clear that something wasn't right. It was like I was being haunted by that phone call, as if it was a warning or some kind of curse. I tried to calm myself and continue driving. I kept my phone off for the rest of the night. But when I pulled into a rest stop a few hours later, I couldn't help myself. I turned the phone back on, praying that I'd find a signal, maybe some explanation for what was happening. But when I looked at my recent calls, I saw something that made my stomach drop. The unknown caller number was still there, listed multiple times, over and over again. Each call had a timestamp, and the most recent one was from less than 5 minutes ago.